Morning. It's Wednesday, April 13th. I think the Titanic is on its way somewhere. Years ago.
Oh, sure.
So it's one of my favorite movies. And so that's April 13th. I believe it was April 13th or 14th.
Remind me, Senator Sears, to give you this weird coincidence that a guy had written, like in early 1800s, had written a book about a ship that is about the same size, same number of passengers, doesn't have enough lifeboats, hits an iceberg, people drown, and the name of the ship that he wrote about was the Titan. It was
actually it was wrong. It left yesterday from Southampton.
It left yesterday.
It is a true story.
It is a true story. I mean, it's an author that wrote the book.
So
I mean,
if ever there was a case of economic justice issues, those people who were in the lower decks were certainly at a disadvantage to those that were in the higher decks. So,
yeah, right.
To think about. Anyhow, enough of the Titanic. I guess it was April 15th that it went down. So anyway, our first guest is Dr. Eitan Nasriddin Longo, the chair of RDAP. So take it away, Eitan.
Good morning. You would like, please, I just need some clarification here. Me to just give you some history about how we've gotten to H546, correct?
Any changes that you think should be made?
I'm sorry, sir, you got cut off.
My internet's unstable, and I don't know why. Any change, the history would be helpful of why we're developing this. I think I know, but be helpful. And the second would be changes that you think should be made to the House passed version.
Okay. The history begins back, as certainly Reverend Hughes knows, with Act 54 of 2017, which was also the act that enabled the RDAP itself. One of the things that the RDAP was asked to do in that legislation was, of course, create a report that addressed a number of issues, including whether to expand law enforcement race data collection practices to include data on non-traffic stops by law enforcement. The panel spent a great deal of time on that issue of data collection, and they believe it to be a vital issue and one that needs to be addressed early as we grapple with the challenges and injustice represented by racial disparities. We came up with a rather lengthy list of recommendations, and in fact, H546 was in many ways, or at least the division as it's now being called, was prefigured very strongly by these recommendations in 2019. One of the recommendations, the panel urges strongly a commitment to staffing and other resources to collect and compile data properly. This could include creating centralized statewide staffing with responsibility for assisting with data collection and compilation from police agencies and other entities across the state. A focus on consistency, clarity, and accessibility of data across all data collection efforts. And finally, mechanisms to assure accountability and compliance. That's just one small part of the report from 2019, which in general is a report from a fairly high altitude. You yourself, Senator Sears, will probably remember that when David Scher and I presented this report, there was some feeling on the part of the Senate Judiciary Committee that more detail would be desired, and indeed it was forthcoming. Another report was written the following year that actually focused even more closely on data. This was something, again, that was asked for by the legislature, and that was in response to Act 148. That report consisted, one of its hallmarks, I should say, were prioritized lists of data to be collected in both the juvenile legal system and the adult criminal legal system. We felt that there were a lot of data to be collected at various high impact and high discretion moments within both systems. But we realized at the same time that all of that could not be done at once. So we spent an enormous amount of time, in fact, prioritizing which data should be looked at first, should be collected first. There are in that report, again, referring to Act 148, several very detailed graphs that were prepared with the help, and actually I shouldn't say the help, they really prepared the graphs. This would be the Crime Research Group, and in particular, Dr. Robin Joy, to talk about where the data are siloed at the moment, where they can be found, or in fact, if they even exist. We also included in this report statutes that were used in the state of Connecticut concerning the collection of relevant data, because Connecticut, in fact, is doing this at this moment and has been doing it. We were connected with these people by way of the Council of State Governments, which was also very helpful in the preparation of this report that responded to Act 148. Finally, we had sort of thought that this report would give the legislature everything it needed to do what needed to be done. And there was we were wrong. And so we came up last summer, between August and November, we were asked by Act 65 of last year to create yet another report. And this is where what is now being called the Division of Racial Justice Statistics came about. I would like to read a little bit of that report, a paragraph. The RDAP views this report as a continuum of the work that it has already submitted to the legislature in its reports of December of 2019 and December of 2020. It submits this report with the understanding that its recommendations herein are consistent with the central and underlying principles previously identified and discussed in its two earlier reports. In preparing this report, the RDAP was guided by and relied heavily upon the principles set out in the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, that is the AISP Racial Equity Toolkit. And this is a quote from that. This body of work seeks to encourage shifts of awareness and practice by centering racial equity and community voice within the context of data integration and use. Our vision is one of ethical data use with a racial equity lens that supports power sharing and building across agencies and community members, unquote. That was a guiding principle in coming up with what we were calling the Office of Racial Justice Statistics in our report. that was those were guiding principles in the creation of the report, and indeed of the body that we suggested and proposed, and also in the support that body would need. What I am getting back mostly from the RDAP is concerned with questions of the advisory panel that we have suggested for this particular body. We believe that's essential. We know that there has been some talk about shifting that to the RDAP. I have said, I think both here and in other legislative committees, that the RDAP's enabling legislation is not for it to be the RDAP that does data. We have a lot of other issues currently on our plate. We are looking at our statutory requirements and responsibilities focused upon the Criminal Justice Council and other bodies, which we have let go because we have been working so hard on the data issue. We're aware that there is some feeling against this advisory panel, and I'd like to read a short paragraph that one of our members, Witchy R2, who is both a data analyst and a social justice activist, wrote about this. The point of that council, that advisory council, is to give power to the people whose data is collected, analyzed, and made decisions on. We, meaning the RDAP, are not them. Let me just repeat that. We are not them. We make decisions and can provide advice on what to do with the data, given our goals and agenda, but the data is not about us. It's for us. This advisory council would be a group who the data is about, getting to decide how their data is being used. As an incidental point that you may want to know, this is an old saw. I mean, this has guided modern anthropology since the 1970s. Gathering data on various disadvantaged or distanced groups and needing to get their feedback about how that data is used has become a staple of current anthropological practice. This is not an unusual request, and we view it very much as necessary. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Are there questions? Senator Bruce, can you take over for a second? Thank you.
Sure. I do have one question, Eitan, and I'm wondering if I've understood. You were very clear about your feeling that this new advisory panel is necessary. I'm wondering, you talked about RDAP being very deeply involved in the data questions since its inception. And I think that's where some of the feeling comes from, that it is duplicative to have a second advisory council, since we have been looking to RDAP for advice about data. And would it, so I guess what I hear you saying is that you would continue to not address the other parts of your mandate if we were to ask you to continue to work with data. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Anything else you'd like to add then, Eitan?
Not that comes to mind right now. I sort of put forth what I think was most important, was a short history. And then from what I have been told, I mean, the main concern being this council that we proposed. I just needed to make the case for that.
Okay.
That's all.
All right. Any
Well,
questions
yeah.
for Eitan?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, Jeanette.
Hi, Adon, and I think I'm the skunk at the garden party here. I'm the one that I'm primarily, well, I think everybody agreed with me, but we took it on in our committee. And when I look at this, the role of this advisory council is, first of all, I think RDAP is the appropriate place to figure out what kind of data needs to be collected, because you've been working on that for a long time, not necessarily how to use it, but what is the data that needs to be collected, because you've been working on that. And then the role of this advisory council is to evaluate the data and analyze and analysis received from the division and make recommendations to the division as a result of the evaluations. And my concern here is that it's 5 people from community that are making now recommendations that are analyzing this data, and they're not necessarily data analysts. They're evaluating the data that's been received and making the recommendations to the executive director, the division, and the executive director of what to do with that data. And that somewhat concerns me, that they represent particular communities, but they're not data analysts, and they're not, anyway, that's a real concern I have. And then this setting up these 12 liaisons, it just seems to me overly bureaucratic when the division the 3 people that are hired would be could work with communities instead of setting up a whole advisory council.
Let me take that on. You raised 3 points. First off would be that none of us on the RDAP, with the exception of Witchy, are data analysts or experts. None of us. The reason that the report exists on which H546 is based is because we worked with the crime research group, and they were able to direct us in great measure. So that's one point. The other point is that these people that we are proposing have lived experience, are in a position to say, and this is important, that a particular datum or group of data are not really important from the standpoint of lived experience. Again, from the standpoint of lived experience. That again is something that not everyone on the RDAP is going to have, particularly given the precise nature of the list of people that we would ask would be included on the advisory council. Does that help you?
No, can I just ask you a question about that? Because maybe I completely misunderstand that, but so what you're saying is that the group, it's 5 communities here. It's 5 different groups of people that represent different, moving to Vermont as an immigrant or refugee, facing evictions. So you're saying that if that person on the advisory council that represents a group who face evictions regularly, if they say, wait a minute, this data isn't important, you shouldn't be collecting that, then we won't collect it?
I think it would be more, I think that's a little too summary. I think the idea is there would then be a discussion initiated.
About why we would collect the data, but people, okay.
And how the data would be used.
Well, I assume the data would be used to help make policy decisions. Otherwise, why collect the data?
That is true,
but yeah.
No, that's absolutely true, but it's not just a question of what data is collected, it's how it's collected and how it's used. it is possible to analyze data in a way that can be described as discriminatory. I mean, that describes the history of anthropology very accurately until approximately the 1970s. The idea of having these people on this panel or on as part of this division is to make sure that that does not occur.
I'm worried about the time, and we're almost 25 after 9. I've got 5 other witnesses, and we're supposed to be done with this topic at 9:45. I'm happy to try to hold off till next week on this bill, but that's our final week of the session. We get deadlines that we don't control, and I don't know that this bill's going to make it. So I hope if we can get the Government Operations Committee is willing to make recommendations on this section. Do you have time to meet with Eitan?
Sure. I will make, oh, I'm sorry. I thought, misunderstood, Senator, sorry.
I think we both
No.
said sure, so I think that means we can both.
I think the question is, can we leave this topic to the Government Operations Committee that is mainly the group that deals with boards and commissions? They don't have the same deadline I have.
Okay.
They meet in the afternoon, so they don't get shut down. Talk about unfairness.
And who made those decisions? The afternoon committees.
Right, yeah. Somehow. Well, right. I really want to hear from Jay Green, and I know Robin Joy is ill today. But we'll try to get, and I want to get to Mark Hughes. He's on 2 bills this morning, so I want to make sure he gets heard. Are there any other questions that don't have to do with the advisory group? Yeah, I do think that the Connecticut example is a good one. And did Connecticut have an advisory group? That's what
I am trying to remember. There have been so many reports. I believe they did, yes.
Well, maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but Mark, and I can't think of his last name, who's the new head of criminal justice in Connecticut. And it completely spaces my memory, but he's I would hope that the Government Ops Committee could meet with him, hear from him. He's a former staffer with the Council of State Governments Justice Center and then moved on to the position in Connecticut.
Mark Pelka.
Mark Pelka. Thank you. Yeah. And I'm sure he'd be happy to talk with your committee.
I would imagine.
Yeah. All right, great. The next is Jay Green. Thank you, Lee.
You're welcome.
Jay, welcome to Senate Judiciary. I don't think we've ever met before. I'm Dick Sears, the chair. With us is Senator Baruth, the vice chair. We're both remote. And in the room is Senator Benning, Senator Nitka, and Senator White.
Hey, Jay.
Yes.
We make up the entire committee.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm here on behalf of my supervisor, Susanna Davis, the Executive Director of Racial Equity. My name is Jay Green. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Racial Equity Policy and Research Analyst. I was recently hired by the office. And so I'm here to, I have a prepared statement from Susanna to read that's very short. I can speak briefly just to give a brief example of the kind of data advisory piece that someone with lived experience can serve. So I, as a non-binary person, frequently find myself explaining to people that sex and sex assigned at birth and gender are 2 different demographic measures. And when we think about how sex data is collected and how gender data is collected, that those should be two different measures, and that someone's lived experience of their gender identity is more important to how they move through the world. So having that kind of perspective to clarify, to point out things that people who are cisgender, meaning that they identify with the same gender that they were assigned based on their sex, may not immediately understand. So that kind of lived experience can be very helpful because otherwise you have sort of a perpetuation of the same resource methods and methodologies and questions that have been developed in a culture that prioritizes the experiences and knowledge bases of the dominant social hierarchies. So anyway, I'm getting off topic. That was just, I wanted to give a brief comment on the importance of lived experience in guiding the data collection process, because people who have experienced discrimination can point out things that may be missed by people who have been trained in data analysis and data collection practices from a academic standpoint. Anyway, thank you for letting me speak on that. And moving into the statement that Susanna gave me to read today, the Office of Racial Equity supports H546. This bill seeks to close a gap in administration, operations, data, and policy by streamlining the process of aggregating and analyzing criminal justice data. More importantly, those activities would happen using a racial equity lens, which will help the state dig deeper into the racial disparities that persist for residents and visitors across Vermont. While the office supports the bill, there are several factors we ask the committee to keep in mind to ensure that the division is set up for success. First, the staffing. Data experts from within state government and from outside state government participated in the RDAP's deliberations for months and agreed on the minimum number of 5 staff to handle the prescribed workload effectively. Through negotiations in the House chamber, the staffing has reduced to the number currently in the bill, which I believe is 3 staff people for the Division of Racial Justice Statistics. The office strongly urges the committee not to reduce this number any further. Data architecture and data infrastructure management are highly specialized professions, and there's an industry-wide set of activities that each of these positions is expected to perform. By cutting the staffing any further, we would further risk having too few doing too much work, especially given the fact that this bill establishes timelines for the completion of this work that were based off of the original staffing numbers of 5. Secondly, for legal support, the Agency of Administration is quite small with bare bones central staffing. Despite the agency's statewide reach, it has no general counsel's office and instead relies on the Attorney General's office for its legal needs. As the Division of Racial Justice Statistics will need to enter into memoranda of understanding and participate in other regulatory processes, it will be important to ensure that the Attorney General's office is aware of the expectation and has the capacity to support the work of the division. The most important part of this work is not the data collection and analysis, but rather the actions that we will take as a result of what we learn. We see this bill and this work stream that it creates as a step towards better policy that is more insightful and more inclusive. As such, we remind the committee that this is an investment that will help us make better investments in the future. This division is not the end of our investment in justice equity. We look forward to working with the accompanying advisory council and the legislature on these matters. So that is Susanna's prepared statement that I have read for you. And I am happy to answer any questions that may arise from that testimony.
Senator Sears, I have a question.
Yes, Senator Nitka.
Thank you, Jay. I would like to have a copy of Susanna's statement, so I'm wondering if you could get that to Peggy Delaney, who's our administrative assistant here, because there was a lot in it and I couldn't take enough notes. So
absolutely, I will ask Susanna to finalize this draft, and I will send a copy to Peggy.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions for Jay? Jay, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it. Nice to meet you. Actually, I had the wrong person sick. Robin Joy is here from the Crime Research Group. It's Karen Gannett that is ill. Robin, thank you for pinch-hitting.
Thank you, Senator. For the record, Dr. Robin Joy, Director of I want to say that I wholeheartedly support Eitan's testimony.
Robin, can you turn your volume
Turn your
up?
volume up, please.
Oh, no, I don't know how to do that.
Or go closer to the
Go
mic?
closer.
Well, I'm actually on a landline, so.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Well, we'll have to do with what we've got.
All right, I'll speak loudly. I'll speak loudly. So I wholeheartedly support Eitan's testimony and will be happy to address the issue of the advisory council from a data integration perspective with GovOps. We do support the advisory council as it was in our reports that we helped RDAP with and in the House bill. We also support Susanna's testimony for the need for staff. We have been working separately from this process with the National Criminal Justice Reform Project. This is funded by the National Governors Association, the National Criminal Justice Association, and Arnold Ventures. And with an interdisciplinary group of criminal justice professionals here in Vermont, we secured funding to begin the hard part of this data integration work, independent of this office. So there's been a group that's been meeting weekly, and we have been updating RDAP and citizen participants about the nuts and bolts of data integration. So what laws govern who can see the data, right? So you guys have been dealing with a lot of expungements and sealings. So how does that affect the data that's going to come into this bureau? What about data quality and data integrity? Garbage in, garbage out. What data sets are available to be analyzed right now and merged right now that we have a high confidence level in that this is accurately representing what we think it's representing. So this has been a process that we're working with ADS. We have been funding with our outside funding a grant, this position in ADS to help shepherd this process. At the end of this process, which will end in May, we will have a charter, a document on how to go about doing this. And we're hoping for a very warm handoff, should this bill pass, to the division. And Susanna has been kept informed, and Jay as well, about our process here. So we have been moving forward with this so that we think that some of the timelines are optimistic in the bill, but there are some things that can be done right away that can help provide some answers. One thing that I want to point out that I testified to in the House and submitted written testimony to, and I can resubmit it here, is that there are some groups that may not be represented in the data for a comprehensive analysis. So if you recall the great work from Council of State Governments, that after 6 years worth of data, they were still only able to tell you about the experiences of Black people in the system. They weren't able to tell you about the experiences of Asian folks or Indigenous, and there were lots of reasons for that. And mostly it's because as you start, slicing and dicing the data, you end up with a very small number of some marginalized folks, and we can't describe their experiences mathematically. And the same is true, although this bill is dealing with racial equity, the same is true for LGBTQ and et cetera. So we suggested, in a world where there's lots of money to put to this, at least considering the option of funding qualitative analysis. We strongly believe that listening to people about their lived experiences is probably a really good way to understand where maybe we can make policy changes. But we do want you to be aware that there are groups that will be, it will take years and years and years of data collection to capture their stories, and that rigorous qualitative analysis is a better and faster way to get at those. I have.
Senator Sears?
I think you should take over,
Okay.
Senator.
Is that your opening statement, Dr. Joy?
And the closing statement, yep.
Okay. Any questions for Robin Joy? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Joy. We're under a little bit of a time crunch, so we'll move on if we can. Falco Schilling is up next. Falco, are you ready? There you are.
Yep. Happy to join the committee this morning. Thank you so much. For the record, my name is Falco Schilling, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Vermont. So I'll try and keep this as short as possible. You have my written testimony as well, which will go into a little bit more detail. But I think at the highest level, just want to say that we are strongly supportive of this piece of legislation. You heard from Dr. Nesrat-Longo about the long history of work that has gone into this piece of legislation over the last couple years. And it is exciting to see it get this close to the finish line. So I think highest level, we would want to say we really hope to see this legislation pass in some form this year, and hope that that can happen with the collaborative work of this committee and with the Government Operations Committee. There are two suggested changes that I identified in my testimony. One of which is enumerating specific data to actually be collected. So last year there was two companion bills based off of the RDAP recommendations introduced in the House and the Senate. So the Senate bill was S-108, which I believe is on the wall in this committee. And we would ask the committee to look at some of those recommendations, so the actual required data collection in that bill, to enumerate that as initial data to be collected and examined at the start of, as this bill passes, and then allow the division to expand upon that and clarify exactly what other data points they might think are necessary. But those, we believe, are strong baseline data that we would like to see enumerated in statute to be collected. And then the other point came out of a discussion that this committee had, I believe last week when we took up the bill. Senator White made a very excellent point when folks were talking about kind of carrots and sticks around data collection, and referenced Act 166 of 2020, which had a number of pieces of that legislation that pertain to the Criminal Justice Council. And one of them in particular pertained to law enforcement and requirements for the collection and sharing of certain data points that were already required under statute. So I think just looking at how that bill is drafted, we would just suggest that data requests from the division also be included in that section of the law, and that is 9 VSA section 2359. Just so that would be in line with other data collection requirements and how law enforcement is dealing with them, and the stick of requiring them to provide that information or else they lose the services of the police academy and the Criminal Justice Council. So those are the two major changes that we propose, but at the highest level, we would like to see this bill move this year and pass so we can begin moving this work forward, because we've seen over the last couple of years just how important this data is and making good policy decisions, starting specifically with justice reinvestment, where that data-driven decision-making and policy-making is already bearing bearing fruit and improving the lives in our criminal legal system, of people in our criminal legal system. I think you heard testimony earlier around how changes in furlough have been happening due to some of the data-driven decisions that this committee made. And we think this is really important as we need to address the racial disparities that we know exist within our criminal legal system here in the state. So kept that as short as possible under the time constraints, and be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Falco. Questions for Falco Schilling?
Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Well,
Okay.
I'm sorry I missed your testimony. I had a little problem here at the house, which happens frequently when you're at home. Just like in the building where you get called away. But we did get your statement, and very helpful.
Yep, and yeah, this is all contained in our written statement. I think just at the highest level, appreciate the committee taking this up with the limited time you have, and hope to see it pass this session.
Though, is how you use the data is critical, because it's only You can use the data about traffic stops, and we have a bill coming up that looks at secondary enforcement of minor traffic offenses. So you could look at and just make make them no longer primary offenses to traffic offenses to lessen the racial disparities in the stops, but you've only lessened the stops. You haven't changed the attitude or the policies. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I mean, I don't have any opposition to not require, to changing the law about, carrying a license.
Well,
Or,
happy to speak more about that bill in the future, but I'll just say I think the committee's work that you have done around justice reinvestment provides a great example of how you can use that data to inform really sound policy that makes strong impact, like very important impacts on our systems. And I think, the proof is in the pudding when it comes to that bill and the work that's happened around justice reinvestment. I think it's a great example.
The elephant in the room is substance abuse, in my opinion, and how we deal with that as a state. At any rate, thank you. Reverend Mark Hughes, Executive Director of Justice for All.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and I am getting a message that I can't start my video yet. Okay, I think I'm ready here.
Can hear you, we just can't see. Oh, now we see you.
So I'll do the best I can with the 45 seconds that remain. Unless you had some other ideas.
I'm not holding you to 45 seconds, Mark.
So, should I take a minute and a half, Mr. Chair?
How about 5-10 minutes at the most? How's that?
That's fine.
Because we're only eating into your time on the next bill.
For the record, I'm Mark Hughes, the Executive Director, Reverend Mark Hughes, the Executive Director of the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance and Justice for All. I'm also a minister here at the only Black church in Vermont, and I'm the Vice Commander of the Veterans of Foreign War here in Burlington as well, amongst other things. Thanks for the time, allowing an opportunity to come to testify before you on this bill. We also support it. Had the opportunity to listen to all of the testimonies in complete concurrence with all of them. We certainly have a different angle, and I think everyone on here, maybe with the small exception of Senator Bayruth, knows that every time I come into Judiciary or go into House Government Operations, we're generally talking about racial justice. We're talking about racial equity. That is the angle that we're approaching this policy from, as you know. Back in 2017, when the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel was passed, there was an accompanying report that came from the Attorney General and the Human Rights Commission Task Force on Act 54 Racial Disparities in State Systems, and it identified disparities across all systems of state government. I'll preface what I'm saying right now is when Commissioner Sherling was the chief of police here in Burlington, my wife was at the time fighting for race data collection during that time frame. She was fighting with a group of folks called Uncommon Alliance, if y'all recall, and that fight continues. So we continue to look for this maturity of and also the accountability in collecting race data at a minimum in policing. She and I both resigned from the RDAP. It wasn't moving fast enough, and we felt there were systemic racism practices that were playing out even in that. But we did present a minority report. In short, none of this business on race data is moving fast enough. And it's been 5 years since this report came out. It says in this report, I'll quote just one thing from the executive summary. It says, to this end, this report recommends that the state prioritize initiatives to reduce and eliminate racial disparities across state systems, much as we have prioritized the opiate crisis. The adoption of indicators or benchmarks and performance measures by each state entity that can address existing disparities within that agency's purview and the coordinated approach to data collection, sharing, and reporting will result in improved conditions over time. I think it's good that we're talking about data collection. When we were in House, when we were in Senate, Government Operations in 2018, the following year, there were three priorities that S281 that we introduced prioritized. If you don't recall, S281 went on to create the Office of Racial Equity. One was providing education on systemic racism and how to combat it. One was mitigating systemic racism in all systems of state government. And the third one was to create a centralized platform for race-based data collection and overseeing its collection and dissemination. I agree with you, Mr. Chair, as I move towards closing, that we should identify why it is that we're collecting data. And it's not just for state purposes. What I submit to you is one of the reasons why, and we have multiple, the Racial Justice Alliance, we have a team of data specialists that collect data. If you go to our website, we have a platform where you can go and identify various key data points. Did you know that only 0.2% of the farmland in Vermont is owned by Black people? That's just an example of some of the data that we're collecting and will continue to do so. You should look at the housing data for Black people in Burlington. Here's what we think data should be collected for: to establish a benchmark, because we've already determined that systemic racism is a thing. You did that in your joint resolution last year when you acknowledged that you were committed to eradicating systemic racism. The second reason to collect data is to measure our progress, because there are a lot of things that are going on that seek to address and sometimes incidentally address these disparate outcomes, either adversely or in positive ways. And then the third way is obviously policy. So I think we've been talking about a third of what we'd like to do, but there are multiple reasons that those of us who are outside of state government, particularly those of us who are advocates or abolitionists, since we are abolishing slavery from the Constitution this year, would seek to collect data for. I'd leave you with an analysis from a group that we called, that was a stakeholder meeting in 2017, in September of 2017. It was a stakeholder meeting from the Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel, Attorney Generals and Human Rights Commission's task force. There was a stakeholders meeting convened by the Attorney General and the Human Rights Commission. And the name of the group was Horizontal. It was a horizontal group. And what we did is we talked about various impacts that were occurring across all state systems and the commonalities between them. If we don't collect data across all systems, then we're never going to be able to create policy that addresses all systems. The reason why I'm bouncing back and forth between here and government operations, and in some cases in the House, various other committees, is because there's a horizontal mission that we have in addressing this thing called systemic racism. So what this thing did come up with, though, is that, yes, data collection was one of the major issues across all of these systems. I would just go on to say that, I'd be happy to come in and tell you more, Mr. Chair, about our feelings, but broadly speaking, and I believe Senator White is already familiar with this, I think where this policy falls short is that it fails to suggest that we collect data across all systems of state government, as the enabling statute of the Racial Equity Executive Director suggests we should. You see, it's good and it's cute when we talk about collecting data in the criminal justice system, especially when it's just to save money, justice reinvestment. But what we're talking about is collecting data to mitigate systemic racism for that particular purpose. That is why the RDAP was created in the first place. That is why the Office of Racial Equity was created in the first place. And it was always our intent that there be a platform and an apparatus whereby data could be collected to baseline, measure, as well as establish policies to that end. And that is to mitigate systemic racism. I'll leave it there for now in the interest of time, especially since you told me I was only eating into my own. And and if I have the opportunity to come back and give you more information on our thoughts surrounding the necessity, particularly in light of the fact that we're looking back now, Mr. Chairman, over a 20-year period since we've been talking about collecting data, specifically in this case, primarily it was law enforcement data. And the fact that the data apparatus that we're talking about creating within state government, the predecessor for us to collect data that mitigates systemic racism across all other systems is the criminal justice system. In other words, it's the long pole in the tent. It is keeping us from being able to expand that data collection capacity across other systems. And I don't want to wait around another 20 years before we get to the next system. I'll take your questions now. Thank you.
Have another 20 years, so.
So
I just, Mark, I appreciate your comments. I just want to make clear that to me, justice reinvestment is not about saving money. It's a byproduct of it, but it's bettering, lowering recidivism, so fewer victims of crime. It's about helping those who are offenders with community programming rather than jail programming. And so I just want to make that clear. I strongly believe in that. And I'll give you one other. You mentioned opiate problem, which has been a problem for years. But one of the most, I guess somebody really put me in my place a few years ago. I was at a meeting of actually a meeting with a number of legislators from other states. It was Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional meeting. And I was in a meeting with a number of folks. And I remember a Black representative from New Jersey talking to us and scolding us for the fact that it wasn't until it had started affecting white kids that we really got upset about the opiate problem that had been going on for years in Black communities and in his area of New Jersey. And it did put me in my place and made me realize, it's an unfortunate byproduct of systematic racism. And that's part of the reason that I'm committed to trying to get this done. So, thank you, Mark. Are there any other questions for Mark? Senator White.
this is not so much a question as it is just agreeing with Mark on one of the major points here is that I firmly believe that we need to have some standardized way of collecting data across all of the state government and probably local and municipal too, because we collect it in silos, and that doesn't make any sense. And we collect different data for health purposes, different data for home ownership. Now we're doing criminal justice, and I firmly believe. I mean, I'm going to support the collection of this data because it is important. But I really, really wish we could somehow standardize the data that's being collected across all agencies of the state and all departments so that we really could see what's going on in state government. So I couldn't agree with Mark more about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to note that the comment made on the business of opioids, that was actually a quote from the report that was written 5 years ago. And in regarding just, perspectives on what the Justice Reinvestment Act is for, if nothing else, by name and in title, justice reinvestment, what it sounds like is we're looking to save some money. I think we've done it before. We've reduced the prison population maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. And that was focused on, the bottom line. I think, there's plenty of room, Mr. Chair, in the room for different perspectives on this. Then the only one that I can give you from this chair is the perspective of an African-American man that's doing racial justice in Vermont in working at various levels across state government as well as in our communities, in identifying the work that is being done and associating it with outcomes, and we're interested in outcomes. So I appreciate the opportunity to testify on this, and again, just lift up with what Senator White is communicating surrounding a desire. Yeah, I think it really speaks to some of our previous testifiers, some of the previous testimony about the need to have some community involvement, because there is a perspective that state government has, that legislators have, that policymakers, that the executive branch has in what it is that we're doing here. And then there is a perspective of what it is that we're doing from outside. We'd like that data, those data too. We'd like other data as well. We'd just like it for other reasons. And we may have different priorities in terms of when we would require that data and how we would require that data. For example, housing data is very important right now. Economic development and economic data in terms of wealth in this state, and home ownership and land ownership. These are important data. And I think it is incredibly frustrating to me personally, sometimes to think of the fact that as we are making every effort that we can, and we have historically been making every effort that we can to make progress in the so-called criminal justice system, to ease the adverse impact of that system on the lives of Black and brown folks, while at the same time, the resources that are going into that and that are being allocated to it are siphoning resources away from the efforts that we could be making towards economic development and towards wealth management and wealth development, towards health equity as well. So it's, and I just, I urge you, I plead you, I implore you to just kind of think about it for a second. If you were in a situation, and this might be a teachable moment, but if you are in a situation where you felt that you were in imminent danger, or perhaps there was at least a threat against you, but at the same time, there were basic necessities that you needed that had generationally not been afforded to you and your family, but you were so busy trying to keep this threat or danger from harming you or the ones you love that you didn't have time to invest in or to pursue the things that would actually enable you and generations to come to thrive. That would be frustrating. That, Mr. Chair, is what we're talking about. So again, I implore you as a committee is to reflect upon the work that we've done here. Reflect upon the fact that when we came here with, at the time was S116 on your wall, and I believe it was four something in the House, and you did the work, Mr. Chair, and you made that happen. A lot of it had to do with Senator White, because she did pull a hat trick, but we were able to get RDAP over the finish line, but we did it. The reason why we brought that to you wasn't because we were concerned about the criminal justice system, it's because we were concerned about racial equity and justice. And the RDAP was an offshoot of that. And this report is proof of what I'm telling you. It's about all systems. And that is why the following year, we created the Office of Racial Equity. And Senator White knows, Mr. Chair, that she and I went round and round in that committee about what to do about data to support that effort. We're here again. This is an opportunity. I implore you to seize the moment and expand this policy to address data across all systems.
Thank you. We're going to move on to H551, and our first witness on H551, which has to do with racially restrictive covenants and religious restrictive covenants. Our first witness is Reverend Mark Hughes.
Okay.
Oh, come on.
You're our only witness today,
Give you time
besides
to
Eric. You want to take a short break, Mark?
I'll take a short break. I just got some notes to dig up. I'll be back in 2 minutes.
Okay. fine. Committee, 2-minute break. Don't go off. Just give people a chance to stretch.
Are you putting us offline? Do you want me to go offline, Senator Shears? I think he said no. Sure.